The Mongols won one of the most decisive military victories in history, and it destroyed them. June 26, 1243. Kose Dag, the beardless mountain. 30,000 Mongol horsemen face 80,000 soldiers, Seljuk cavalry, Frankish knights, Georgian heavy infantry, Arab fighters, Byzantine mercenaries. The largest army ever assembled in Anatolia, built for one purpose: stop the Mongols before they swallow the world. By mid-morning, that 80,000-man army has ceased to exist. But the Mongols rode into Anatolia with no plan beyond domination, no vision beyond conquest. What they created instead, in the chaos they left behind, was the Ottoman Empire, one of the longest-lived dynasties in history. The power that would conquer Constantinople, rule 3 continents, and terrify Europe for 6 centuries. They won the battle, they lost the future, and they never even knew it.
Before we dive into this, if you're new here, this channel is built around exactly these kinds of stories, the turning points nobody put in the textbooks, the battles that reshaped the world while everyone was looking somewhere else. Hit subscribe, smash that like button, and drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. Let's get into it. To understand how completely the Mongols broke Anatolia that day, you need to understand what they broke. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was not a declining power. It was not some crumbling relic barely holding together. By 1243, it was 2 centuries old, battle-hardened, and sitting at the crossroads of everything that mattered. The name says it all. Rum, meaning Rome. The Seljuks saw themselves as the rightful heirs to Roman Anatolia, and they had the track record to back it up. In 1071, their ancestors crushed the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert, sent the Greeks fleeing back to Constantinople, and planted their flag across the Anatolian plateau. Their capital at Konya was a genuine metropolis. Tens of thousands of people. Silk Road merchants flooding the bazaars with Chinese goods and Indian spices, poets composing in Persian, architects building mosques and caravanserais, so beautiful that some still stand today, their stone carved with geometric patterns, so intricate, they look impossible. This wasn't a weak state. This was civilization at its peak, which makes what happened next that much harder to stomach. The Sultan in 1243 was a man named Kose Dag II, and he was everything a medieval ruler couldn't afford to be: young, impulsive, convinced of his own invincibility. He'd inherited a stable, prosperous kingdom from his father Kose Dag, a man who'd built that stability through decades of careful diplomacy, pay tribute when necessary, fight when advantageous, never pick a fight you can win. Kose inherited the throne. He did not inherit the wisdom. To his east, a shadow had been building for years. The Mongol Empire was already the largest land empire in history by 1243. Genghis Khan was dead, but his generals had been busy. Persia, conquered. The Khwarezmian Empire, the great Muslim superpower of Central Asia, annihilated so thoroughly it's barely a footnote. The stories filtering into Anatolia from those conquests read like dispatches from hell. Entire cities burned to the foundation. Populations marched into slavery or simply butchered in the streets. Pyramids of skulls left as monuments. Dynasties hundreds of years old erased from history in a single campaign season. For a while, the Mongols and the Seljuks had maintained an uneasy peace. The Seljuks paid modest tribute, some gold, some silk, some horses, and the Mongol general in the region, Charmagan, was content to look east, toward Georgia and Armenia. Nobody was provoking anybody. Nobody wanted war. Then Charmagan died, and was replaced by a general named Baiju Noyan. Baiju was done with diplomatic nicety. His demands were designed to humiliate. Kose had to personally travel to Mongolia, not send an ambassador, go himself, to prostrate before the great Khan. He had to hand over princes of his own blood as hostages. He had to accept Mongol tax officials called darugachi into his court to oversee every financial decision and report everything back to Karakorum. These weren't requests. They were commands written by a man who already knew the answer. Kose refused. Maybe he thought the Mongols were overextended. They were fighting in China, in Russia, in Persia. How much attention could they possibly spare? Maybe he genuinely believed his own propaganda about Seljuk military superiority. Maybe he just couldn't bring himself to bend the knee in front of his own court. Whatever the reasoning, he picked a fight with the most lethal military machine on the planet. Baiju's response was methodical and absolute. In the winter of 1242, his army appeared before the walls of Erzurum, one of the Sultanate's key eastern strongholds. He sent envoys with the standard Mongol offer: surrender or be destroyed. The governor of Erzurum, a man named Yakut, who apparently had more pride than sense, didn't just refuse. He insulted the Mongol ambassadors to their faces, mocked them, threatened them, and sent them away empty-handed. The Mongols brought 12 siege catapults, engines capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds. They pounded Erzurum's walls day and night, sealed off every supply route, and waited with that inhuman Mongol patience. 60 days later, the city fell. What followed was a message written in fire and bodies. The population, soldiers, merchants, craftsmen, children, was slaughtered, buildings demolished, mosques and churches stripped of treasure. The city that had stood for centuries was reduced to ash and rubble. Survivors who fled spread the story across Anatolia like a disease. Then Baiju withdrew to winter quarters and waited. He knew Khusro couldn't let this stand. He knew the Sultan's pride would force a military response. He knew that when the armies finally met, the outcome was already decided. The Seljuks just didn't know it yet. To his credit, Khusro recognized the scale of what was coming. He sent messengers racing in every direction, calling in every favor, calling in every alliance. This was an existential crisis, and he built a coalition to match it. The Empire of Trebizond, that Byzantine remnant clinging to the Black Sea coast, sent troops. The Ayyubid Sultan in Aleppo dispatched warriors. Frankish mercenaries, Christian knights who fought for gold rather than God, brought their heavy cavalry. Georgian nobles arrived with professional heavy infantry. By spring 1243, Khusro had assembled something genuinely impressive: 80,000 soldiers, a multinational army that represented the combined military power of the Islamic world in Western Asia. But here's what nobody mentions about coalition armies. They don't share a language. They don't share a command structure. They don't share tactics, traditions, or trust. Khusro's army spoke a dozen tongues: Turkish, Arabic, Georgian, Greek, Latin. Orders had to be translated, retranslated, sometimes guessed at. The mercenaries owed loyalty to coin, not sultan. The Turkmen tribal cavalry had more in common, culturally, with the Mongols they were about to fight than with the urbanized Seljuks commanding them. Somewhere in those ranks, among the minor Turkish principalities that had sent fighters to the muster, was a family worth noting. A man named Ertugrul led a small Kaya tribal group near the Byzantine frontier. A few villages, a few hundred followers, nobody of consequence. Nobody anyone would bother to write down in the great chronicles of the age. His grandson would be named Osman. But in June 1243, the future was unwritten. The present was all that mattered. The Seljuk army marched west from Konya in late May. 80,000 men on the move, a column stretching miles across the plateau, taking most of a day to pass any given point. Cavalry scouting ahead, infantry grinding through the heat, armor baking in the Anatolian summer sun. Baggage trains creaking behind, loaded with supplies and the full Roman machinery that follows medieval armies. They covered 320 kilometers in stages, moving in the early mornings before the heat became a weapon in itself. By late June, they reached Kose Dag and found it empty. Baiju had gotten there first, but he'd withdrawn. His scouts had been shadowing the Seljuk columns for days, counting numbers, noting formations, reporting everything. When Khusro's vanguard arrived on June 25th, they found Mongol campfires still warm, horse droppings still fresh. No army. Some of the Sultan's men celebrated. They fled, went the cry. They saw our numbers and ran. The smart generals knew better. Mongols didn't flee. They maneuvered. Somewhere just beyond visual range, 30,000 cavalry was setting a trap. That night, the two armies camped within miles of each other. In the Seljuk camp, the atmosphere was electric, that specific cocktail of tension and false confidence that precedes catastrophe. Muslim soldiers faced Mecca and recited Quran. Georgian contingents sang low battle hymns in their ancient language. The Frankish knights drained wineskins and boasted they'd faced horse archers in the Crusades, or so they claimed. Just ride them down. Once you close the distance, their bows are useless. We'll scatter them like chaff. They had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. In the Mongol camp, the mood was different, professional, almost serene. These were men who'd campaigned from Hungary to Korea, who'd seen more battles than most humans see sunrises. They didn't need speeches. They checked bowstrings by firelight, testing tension. They ran whetstones along curved sabers. They inspected their lamellar armor overlapping metal scales, from neck to knee that combined flexibility with surprising protection. Each warrior carried 60 arrows in 2 quivers, 30 on each hip. Every arrow had been inspected that evening. Every horse had been fed, watered, and checked for lameness. Baiju walked among his commanders, speaking quietly. The plan was simple. Mongol plans always were. Let them attack. Use mobility to avoid their charges. Shoot them to pieces from beyond their reach. When they break, and they will break, pursue without mercy. 30,000 against 80,000. Anyone who didn't understand how Mongols fought would call it madness. His veteran generals made one last plea. Lord, hold position. Let them come to us. We have the numbers to form a defensive line they cannot break. Make them pay in blood for every yard of ground. Force them to attack on our terms. His younger nobles shouted them down. We came here to fight. Are we cowards who hide behind walls? We have 80,000 warriors. We'll crush these barbarians. Kekushro made his decision. We attack today. It was the worst decision possible, and he never fully understood why until it was too late. The Seljuk army moved forward across the valley floor, a great wave of men and horses and steel pushing through the morning heat, banners snapping in the hot wind, sunlight fracturing off tens of thousands of spear points until the entire line glittered like a river of silver. On the heights to the northeast, the Mongols waited in absolute stillness, 30,000 horsemen in perfect formation. Not a wasted movement, not a single sound beyond harness jingling and horses stamping. Their composite bows were strung, their quivers were full. Before the main armies even engaged, disaster came from inside Seljuk ranks. One unnamed noble commanding roughly 20,000 men on the right wing couldn't wait. He saw what he thought was numerical inferiority. He saw his chance for glory. Without orders, without coordination, without anything resembling tactical thought, he launched his own charge. 20,000 men broke from the main line and surged toward the Mongol right. The Frankish knights joined them, lances down, armor blazing in the morning sun, convinced that one good charge would end this before breakfast. For a moment, watching from the Seljuk center, it must have looked magnificent. The Mongols did what they always did. They retreated. Not in panic, in perfect formation. The Mongol right wing wheeled and galloped away from the charging Seljuks as smoothly as a flock of birds, banking in wind. Their horses were fresh. Their riders were the finest horsemen alive. They opened distance easily, staying just outside lance range, and as they rode they twisted in their saddles and shot backwards. The Parthian shot, the steppe archer's signature technique, requiring years of training to perfect. The Mongols made it look casual. The first Seljuk horses to close the gap took arrows in the throat. Men toppled from saddles, dead before they hit the ground. Wounded horses screamed and went down, throwing riders into the path of the horses behind, bones breaking under iron-shod hooves. The momentum carried the charge forward like a stone rolling downhill. The attackers were convinced they had the Mongols running. Victory was just ahead. Just a few more yards. They charged deeper into the valley. Farther from the main line, farther from any hope of support, and then the jaws of the trap closed. From the left and right, Mongol cavalry units that had been hidden in dead ground swept inward with mechanical precision. They wheeled around the Seljuk attackers in a perfect horseshoe. The retreating Mongols stopped, turned, and rejoined the battle. In minutes, 20,000 Seljuks found themselves completely surrounded by horse archers, firing from every direction, from ranges where Seljuk bows couldn't reach, but Mongol composite bows killed with ease. The arrows came in swarms, actual swarms, clouds thick enough to dim the sun. They fell like steel rain, punching through leather, finding the gaps between armor plates, dropping horses and men with mechanical efficiency. The Seljuks tried to rally, tried to form defensive circles, but cavalry cannot hold ground under that kind of sustained fire. The Mongols had 60 arrows per warrior, 30,000 warriors, that's nearly 2 million arrows on standby. They didn't need anything close to that number. The Frankish knights tried to charge out of the trap, closing with the enemy, fighting hand to hand, where their armor and training gave them the advantage, and their plate armor did deflect shots that would have killed lighter men. So the Mongols adjusted. Shoot the horses. Once a knight was unhorsed, he was just a man in a metal shell, stumbling around in 100 pounds of steel under the Anatolian sun, easy prey for cavalry to swarm and finish with sabers. By mid-morning, 2 hours after the charge began, 20,000 Seljuk soldiers were dead, captured, or fleeing in blind panic. 3,000 bodies already blackening in the heat, attracting flies in clouds so thick they looked like smoke. The main Seljuk army had watched it happen, stood paralyzed 2 miles away, while a quarter of their force was systematically dismantled in front of them. These weren't peasant conscripts, these were nobles, knights, the best trained cavalry in the coalition. Gone in 2 hours, Khosrow should have retreated, should have withdrawn to Sivas immediately and adopted the defensive strategy his veteran generals had been urging from the start. But retreating now would break what remained of morale, would turn an army into a mob. So he ordered the advance to continue, the worst decision he would ever make. When the main armies finally collided, the fighting was brutal and genuinely contested. This wasn't a rout, not yet. Seljuk infantry pushed forward with spears and shields. Turkish cavalry clashed with Mongol heavy cavalry in swirling, screaming melees of saber and lance. For hours the battle ebbed and flowed, with neither side breaking decisively. The Georgians on the Seljuk left were exceptional, professional soldiers from a culture that had been breeding warriors for generations. They refused to fold. They drove back multiple Mongol charges, held their formation under fire, and for one brief, shining moment, actually counterattacked and pushed the Mongol left wing backward. A gap appeared in the Mongol line. It looked, for just an instant, like it might actually turn, but the Mongols had reserves, fresh units rotating into the line, replacing exhausted ones with the precision of a military machine that had been running these operations for 30 years. The Seljuks had no rotation system. Their men fought until they dropped. As the afternoon wore on, as the sun hammered down with the full force of an Anatolian summer, Seljuk Kishishin began to fracture. The smell of blood was overwhelming now, coppery, hot, thick enough to taste, mixed with the stench of opened bowels and the sweet rot of bodies already starting to cook in their armor. The ground turned slippery with gore. Horses lost footing in mud, made from earth and blood. Wounded men cried for water in a dozen languages. The noise was constant and maddening. Metal on metal, horses screaming, commanders shouting orders no one could hear. Then came the betrayals that finished what the arrows had started. The Turkmen tribal cavalry had always been semi-autonomous, never fully loyal to the urbanized Seljuk court that looked down on them as barely civilized. They started crossing to the Mongol lines, ones and twos at first, then whole units of hundreds, raising their hands in surrender. These Turkmen felt cultural kinship with the Mongols. Both were steppe peoples, both spoke related Turkic languages. Both lived by traditions the settled Seljuks had abandoned generations ago. They switched sides and took Seljuk military intelligence with them. Each defection punched a hole in the Seljuk line. Each hole became a channel for Mongol cavalry to pour through like water through a cracking dam. The Khwarezmian mercenaries, refugees from earlier Mongol conquests who'd already lost everything once to these same enemies, knew exactly what fate awaited prisoners. They fled en masse, riding for the mountains, thinking only of survival. The Seljuk center began to dissolve, slowly, then all at once. Khosrow's personal guard, 2,000 heavy cavalry sworn to die for their sultan, formed around the royal banner, a magnificent silk standard that had flown over victories for generations. They made their stand. Mongol horse archers swarmed them, maintaining their distance, shooting from just outside sword range. The standard bearer took an arrow. His replacement fell, the next man too, until no one would pick it up. and the banner, bristling with arrow shafts like a porcupine, drooped into the dust. A general grabbed Kekosra's bridle and said something urgent. The words are lost, but the meaning was clear. Run now, or die here. The Sultan's nerve broke. He wheeled his horse and galloped for the rear. His guard tried to follow, to shield his retreat with their bodies. Most were cut down within minutes. Kekosra rode for Sivas, didn't stop at Sivas. Rode all the way to Konya, then kept riding to Antalya on the coast, as far from the Mongols as Anatolia allowed. He would survive, his empire wouldn't. The aftermath at Kose Dag was biblical in scale. When burial parties finally approached the field, days later, after Mongol patrols had moved on, they counted 20,000 Seljuk dead, a conservative estimate. Many more had crawled away to die in the mountains. Others had been dragged off by wolves. Some historians put the true toll closer to 30,000. Roughly the same number of men as fought at Waterloo. 6 centuries later, mass graves were dug east of the pass. Bodies thrown in without ceremony, covered in quicklime, no markers, no prayers beyond the hasty blessings of surviving clerics, just holes in the ground that archaeologists would find centuries later. Concentrations of human remains mixed with corroded metal, and thousands of arrowheads, the Mongol losses, perhaps 2,000 to 3,000. Mostly auxiliaries, Armenian and Georgian troops who'd been pressed into service and absorbed the worst of the Seljuk counterattacks. The Mongol core cavalry came through nearly intact, capable of continuing operations immediately. Baiju's army marched on Konya without serious resistance. The peace terms were designed to crush. Annual tribute in gold, silk, horses, camels and slaves, amounts that would require special taxes, that would make Kekosra despised by his own subjects. Half the Sultanate's territory occupied by Mongol garrisons. Derogati officials installed in every major city. The Sultan could keep his title. He had no real power. The coins told the story without words. Pre-1243 Seljuk coins proclaimed the Sultan's glory in bold titles. Post-Kose Dag coins offered only vague, submissive platitudes. Sovereignty belongs to God. No names. No boasts. Just the silence of a dynasty that had been broken in a single afternoon. But here's what the Mongols didn't understand, couldn't have understood. They weren't just conquering a kingdom. They were dissolving the only structure that had kept Anatolia organized for 2 centuries. The Seljuk state hadn't just been a government. It had been a framework, a mechanism for enforcing order, a ceiling that kept ambitious local warlords from growing beyond their station. When that ceiling collapsed, everything changed. Throughout the 1250s and beyond, local strongmen across Anatolia began carving out their own territories. These beyeks, principalities, paid lip service to whoever was nominally sultan in Konya. But in practice, they were independent little kingdoms answering to no one. Each one was a laboratory of political and military experimentation, testing new ideas about governance and warfare that the rigid Seljuk system had never allowed. The political situation deteriorated further from there. Different sultans claimed the throne. The Mongols executed some, installed others, switched them out when convenient. In 1277, the Mamluks from Egypt invaded briefly, trying to expel Mongol authority from Anatolia, won a battle-occupied territory, retreated when Mongol reinforcements arrived. Chaos layered on chaos. Then in 1335, the Ilkhanate, the Mongol state that theoretically controlled Anatolia, collapsed in civil war, its dynasty fragmented. Rival claimants tore each other apart. Central authority evaporated. The Mongol garrisons in Anatolia packed up and left. The tributes stopped being collected. The overlords were gone. Anatolia was free. Free, in this case, meaning completely fragmented. The Seljuk Sultanate ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with a whimper. The last sultan simply vanished from historical records sometime in the early 13,000s, and nobody even bothered to write down exactly when or how the dynasty died. The capital Konya was taken by the Karamanid Turkmens in 1328. End of an empire that had ruled for 2 centuries. What replaced it? A dozen competing beylik seats, each claiming legitimacy. None strong enough to reunify Anatolia under their control. One of those beyliks on the Byzantine frontier near a town called Sout was led by a man named Osman. son of Ertugrul, the nobody tribal leader whose warriors had probably marched in the Great Muster of 1243 and survived the disaster at Kose town. Osman's Beylik was small, poor, seemingly insignificant compared to more established principalities inland. He ruled perhaps a few thousand people, controlled maybe a few hundred square miles of borderland. Nothing that suggested future greatness, but Osman's position was accidentally perfect. He sat on the Byzantine frontier, where aggressive raids against weakened Christian territories yielded land, loot, and glory. He was far enough from major Mongol garrisons to have real autonomy and freedom of action, but close enough to collapsing Byzantine territories that expansion was possible, even easy. The Byzantines themselves were in no condition to resist anyone. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 had sacked Constantinople. The Crusaders had conquered the city themselves, briefly erasing Byzantium from existence. The empire had only recently been restored, barely controlling territory beyond its capital's walls. Anatolia, lost to the Seljuks in 1071, was now a patchwork of competing Turkish principalities the Byzantines couldn't begin to address. Perfect conditions for an ambitious man to build something. Osman and his successors spent decades expanding, absorbing other beyliks through conquest and alliance, raiding and then capturing Byzantine cities one by one, building a war machine and a bureaucratic structure unlike anything Anatolia had seen since the Seljuks fell. By 1326, they had taken Bursa and made it their capital. By 1337, Nicaea fell, the ancient city where Christian councils had once defined the very nature of orthodoxy, now a Turkish city. By the 1350s, the Ottomans had crossed into Europe and were consuming the Byzantine Empire from both sides simultaneously. But here's the twist that closes the circle, and it's almost too perfect. In 1402, the Ottomans faced their own Mongol moment. Timur Tamerlane, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan and had rebuilt a Mongol empire across Central Asia, invaded Anatolia with a massive army. Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, called the Thunderbolt, rode out to meet him near Ankara with 85,000 men. The numbers, the location, the hubris, all eerily identical to Khosrow's fatal decision 159 years earlier at the Battle of Ankara on July 28, 1402. Timur dismantled the Ottoman army through the exact same tactics the Mongols had used at Kose Dag, encirclement horse archers, and defections from Turkmen contingents who felt cultural kinship with their Central Asian cousins and simply switched sides mid-battle. Bayezid was captured, the only Ottoman sultan ever taken prisoner. He died in captivity. The Ottoman Empire fell into civil war. 11 years of brothers fighting brothers, principalities breaking away, the empire fragmenting into chaos. It looked exactly like what had happened to the Seljuks. The pattern was repeating. But here's the crucial difference. The Ottomans survived. Timur died in 1405, preparing to invade China. His empire collapsed within a generation. Meanwhile, the Ottomans pulled themselves together under Mehmed I by 1413. They learned from near death, they centralized harder, rebuilt faster, came back stronger and more determined than before. By 1453, Ottoman cannon were battering the walls of Constantinople, the prize the Seljuks had never taken, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years, the symbol of Christian civilization in the East. The walls that had protected the city through dozens of sieges fell in 53 days. By 1529, Ottoman armies were besieging Vienna. Christian kings across Europe were in genuine terror. The empire the Mongols had accidentally created, by destroying the structure that had prevented it from existing, lasted until 1922, into the modern era. Stand at Kose Dag today, and you won't find much. Turkish farmers plough fields where 80,000 men gathered in June 1243. No monuments, no plaques, no tourist infrastructure. Most visitors to Turkey have never heard the name. The local villagers might know something significant happened there once. The details have faded into folklore and half-remembered legend. History forgot the battle that changed everything. The turning point nobody recognized as a turning point until centuries later. But the consequences live on. Modern Turkey exists partly because of what happened in that mountain pass. The Balkans' complicated history, the ethnic tensions, the religious divisions, the cultural complexity that persists to this day, traces back partly to that morning when the Seljuks shattered and left a vacuum that Osman's descendants spent a century filling. European identity itself was shaped by centuries of Ottoman pressure. The threat from the east that forged alliances, defined borders, and crystallized the very concept of Europe as a unified civilization, defending itself against a common danger. All of it flows from a single afternoon in 1243. The Mongols came to Anatolia to impose order, to collect tribute, to establish a hierarchy with themselves at the top and everyone else beneath, paying and obeying and submitting. They succeeded completely. They broke the Seljuks so thoroughly that Anatolia had no centralized power for nearly a century afterward. And that breaking, that complete, absolute destruction of the old order, created exactly the conditions necessary for dynamic, hungry Beyiks to flourish like plants. Pushing through concrete, Osman's Beyik sat in the perfect position, not through any master plan, but through the accident of geography and the chaos the Mongols left in their wake. The Mongols won the battle. They planted seeds they never intended to sow. Great empires often create their own replacements through destruction. Rome's fall created the medieval kingdoms that became modern European states. The Mongol destruction of the old Islamic order. Baghdad fell in 1258. The Abbasid Caliphate, drowned in blood and burning libraries, created space for new powers to emerge. The Ottomans were the greatest of those successor states, building something larger and longer lasting than anything the Mongols had broken. Destruction is creative. Conquerors plant the seeds of their own replacement. They can't help it, because destruction creates vacuums, and vacuums demand filling. The battle nobody remembers created the empire everybody knows. Think about that next time someone tells you history is the story of great men with great plans. Sometimes the greatest empires in human history were born from complete accident, from chaos, from rubble, from the unintended consequences of someone else's victory. The Mongols won. The Ottomans rose, and in winning the Mongols lost something they never even knew they were gambling: the future.